The Detroit Pistons have been rebuilding since 2008, whether they want to believe it or not. The current results of this rebuild is them having the worst winning percentage in league history as of right now. They're currently winning only 10% of their games, which is actually worse than the 2012 Bobcats, who won 10.6% of their games. And this isn't necessarily all bad for a rebuilding team, as we did see the process Sixers produce some historically bad teams that ended up yielding them high draft picks. And even the Spurs are currently not that far behind the Pistons right now, and they have Wembanyama at least. But as for the Pistons, just based off their past 15 years of front office moves, I just have little hope that they're going to build anything out of this roster despite having some impressive young players on it right now. And I came to this conclusion just by sitting down and looking at all their front office moves over the 15 years and honestly just being amazed by what they've done. If you think the past few years have been bad for what they've been doing in their front office, you'll be amazed by what they did in the first 10 years of this rebuild. And while they have made a few dumb moves over the past few years, I wanted to focus most of this video on the dumb moves they made during the first 10 years of this rebuild, and basically just use that information as a way to make the Pistons situation seem even grimmer than people are realizing. I know everyone's dogpiling on the Pistons right now, but I just think long term, based off of their past front office tendencies, I just have a hard time believing that they're going to build some team that's going to end up even being a contender. So going back to before this rebuild started, in my opinion, the Pistons were one of the best teams of the mid-2000s. Of course, everyone remembers their 2004 finals where they beat the Lakers. But aside from that, from 2003 to 2008, they made at least the conference finals, and they had 2 finals appearances in that time frame. That ended up fizzling out, and they honestly squandered a very weak East towards the end of that. But aside from that, starting when this rebuild really started, in my opinion, was when they traded Chauncey Billups for Allen Iverson at the very beginning of the 2008 season. Now, at this point in both of their careers, they were aging point guards, and they were barely holding on to their all-star level of play. And this is probably the most lateral move in trade history that I've ever seen for someone trying to contend. The Pistons were already kind of aging out at this point, and they really thought bringing in old Allen Iverson for Chauncey Billups was going to change anything for them, instead of just rebuilding at this point. And as a result of this trade, all the veterans on that team got really mad because Chauncey Billups was the glue of that team. And Allen Iverson ended up not having a very good season. And at the end of the season, he literally rage quitted on the Pistons because he didn't want to come off the bench for them. And he refused to play for the Pistons in the playoffs. And they ended up losing in the first round because of that. And because they traded for Iverson instead of just rebuilding in 2008, they ended up getting basically nothing back for that core that won the 2004 finals. They didn't get anything for Billups, really, because Allen Iverson left after one season. They let Rasheed Wallace walk. Ben Wallace walked the year prior, so they got nothing for him either. They basically got nothing out of this team when they could have rebuilt 1 year earlier and probably got some assets out of this. And then the front office went on some type of signing bonanza after this. They didn't make hardly any trades during this time, but they signed a shit ton of players. Mostly just nobodies or just really washed players. So, for example, after everyone left, their 2 big signings that offseason was signing Charlie Villanueva and Ben Gordon to big money at that time. And those are 2 names that the nephews aren't going to know, but for the people that are familiar with those players, it's just head scratching that they were trying to build around these 2 players, because after they signed those 2 people, they just signed a bunch of people that ended up amounting to nothing in the NBA anywhere. And they also signed a few washed up veterans, such as Tracy McGrady. They also signed Kwame Brown. They got Ben Wallace back after he was old. It just didn't really make sense what they were doing during this era, and I've really tried to make sense of it, but I literally can't understand it, period. But during this time of misdirection and lack of identity, they actually did okay in the draft. They weren't getting very high lottery picks, but they were able to draft Greg Monroe, Brandon Knight, and Andre Drummond in 2012. And so in 3 consecutive drafts, I would say they hit. But this all kind of just coalesced into a really weird team in 2013 where they signed Josh Smith to basically pair with Greg Monroe, Andre Drummond. So in about 5 years' time, they went from Chauncey Billups, Ben Wallace, and Rasheed Wallace to Andre Drummond, Greg Monroe, and Josh Smith. Now, if you want to look at some of the up-and-coming teams in the NBA right now, if you look at their 5-year differences during their rebuild, it's looking way better right now. So, for example, with the Thunder, they had Paul George and Russell Westbrook. Now they have SGA and Chet. Or if you look at the Rockets, they used to have Chris Paul and James Harden. Now they have Sengun and Jalen Green. And while we don't know what's going to happen with those teams once they actualize what they've got, these 2013 Pistons did absolutely nothing because they had negative floor spacing. I know people are kind of grilling the Pistons now for having the worst spacing in the league, but this is probably the worst spacing we've seen in the past 10 years because Josh Smith and Greg Monroe and Andre Drummond all have zero outside shot whatsoever. So to no surprise, this team didn't even make the playoffs, and Josh Smith just ended up walking the next season. Greg Monroe also ended up walking shortly after this as well. And so out of this core they built in 5 years, they ended up getting no return on this either. Now, keep that in mind. When we saw with the last core with Billups, Rasheed Wallace, and Ben Wallace, they ended up getting nothing out of it in return. And with this terrible 2013 core, they ended up getting nothing out of them either. Now, a few years after that, they actually made a few okay moves. They traded for Reggie Jackson, they traded for Tobias Harris, and they drafted KCP. And this led to them making the 2016 playoffs, but they were a first-round exit, of course. And then shortly after this, the head-scratching moves just returned because they let KCP walk and restricted free agency somehow. And they ended up trading away Tobias Harris to the Clippers for Blake Griffin because they wanted to make a core of Blake Griffin, Reggie Jackson, and Andre Drummond for some reason in 2018. Blake Griffin was still an all-star when they traded for them, but making that kind of trade at that time just doesn't make sense because I just don't understand why they would think that all-star Blake Griffin, Andre Drummond, and Reggie Jackson would be a team that could go anywhere in the playoffs. They were able to make the playoffs 1 year and they lost in the first round. But the year after that, in 2019, Blake Griffin started having his knee problems, and basically that was the end of that core as well. And we're just about at the point in the modern Pistons era when they actually started to try and rebuild. But as for this core, they ended up trading Andre Drummond while Blake Griffin was hurt that season, and they were only able to really net a second rounder for him. And they also had to buy out Reggie Jackson, and they ended up having to buy out Blake Griffin, but he was never the same player after that, so I didn't expect them to get any value from him. So before I get into some of their recent moves, I just want to use this moment to bring up that they only acquired one first-round pick during this entire 10-year period. And that was in the 2019 offseason where they got the 30th pick. So during this entire time, when they only made the playoffs twice and they exited the first round twice, they acquired basically no draft capital. They got a bunch of second round picks that they didn't do anything with. Any of their young promising players they ended up trading away for basically nothing. Any of these dumbass cores they tried to build, they got nothing for. Josh Smith walked, Greg Monroe walked, Andre Drummond only netted a second round pick basically. Blake Griffin walked and Reggie Jackson walked. They got nothing for their core and they ended up just trading any of their young promising players. And this is really just the result of committing to dumbass cores and trying to make a playoff push during this entire time, but only making the playoffs twice. They ended up just being around the 10 seed for most of this era, and they ended up only getting like the 10th pick in the draft every year because of this. So they ended up in NBA purgatory as a result. And some people like to point out that they didn't draft like certain players that fell lower in the draft that ended up becoming stars. But I don't want to play that card because it's kind of lazy. And I don't think it really matters either because I don't think they would have developed these people anyway because I don't think they really developed a lot of their young players during this time. So Reggie Jackson, for example, is someone I don't think, fully reached his potential. And Andre Drummond is really just the result of taking a 2K player and putting all your VC into rebounding and rebounding badges. Drummond really had no major defensive or offensive improvement during this time, which I feel is probably the failure of the Pistons. But back to where I left off in the 2020 offseason, at this point they had traded Drummond before the deadline in the prior season, and they probably knew at this point that Blake Griffin's knee was done. So they actually tried to have a proper rebuild during this time, but it didn't really work because they had no assets to give up. They made a bunch of trades during this time, and it only really netted them a bunch of second-round picks and a few young players. And this kind of leads to the current era where, like, the last 4 seasons of the Pistons, they've been at the bottom of the league, like, every year. But instead of being, mediocre with no future prospects, really, at least they're bad and they're getting good draft picks as a result. So, for example, in 2021, they got the first pick and they got Cade Cunningham. In 2022, they got the 5th pick and they got Jaden Ivey. In 2023, they got the 5th pick and they got Asir Thompson. So while they are getting some young players right now and they're probably going to have a great draft pick for next year, I just don't have a lot of hope for them based off of this 15-year precedent of not developing their young players, trading away all their promising young players as well, and just not really constructing any coherent rosters. And I still see some of these themes in the past few years with their front office. Like, for example, they traded Sadiq Bey for James Wiseman, and this is what has sparked this crazy losing streak that everyone's been talking about. They also signed Monty Williams for 6 years and made him the second highest paid coach in the NBA, despite Monty Williams being kind of young and unproven, considering that he got outcoached by Jason Kidd in the 2022 playoffs. And I understand that it's probably hard for them to get a coach due to the location and the state of the franchise, but I really think they just need some type of culture guy that they're not going to have to pay that much to kind of kickstart this rebuild. And then they can try and get some type of X's and O guy, even if they have to overpay them. Overall, I'm not even going to try and, suggest what I think that the front office should do going forward or anything, because I just don't have any hope for their front office anyway. And this isn't because they just have like one dude that's been messing up for like 15 years. They've had 4 different GMs during this time. They've had like a coaching carousel during this time as well. So I guess that just goes back to maybe like the owner, for example. Whoever's hiring these GMs doesn't really know what they're doing. So I just don't really have any hope for this because their current GM hasn't been making that good of moves, in my opinion. So in conclusion, even if they're going to get these high draft picks because they're so bad, it's not going to matter if they're going to do things like trade away Sadiq Bey for James Wiseman. And it's not going to matter if they're just not able to develop their players like Killian Hayes, for example. So I don't really know what to say for the Pistons other than they're probably in the worst position in the league right now, in my opinion, just because I just don't have any faith in their leadership, not because I don't think that they're able to get good young players. But anyway, if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe if you want to see any videos in the future. Comment something if you have something to say. And thank y'all for watching. I guess I'll see y'all next time.